began with silence. Not the comforting stillness of a neighborhood asleep, but a silence that stretched too long, clung too tightly, and pressed too heavily on those who sensed it. The house on South Bundy Drive stood still in the glow of the streetlights, the porch light casting sharp shadows across the front walkway. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet something was undeniably wrong. Earlier that evening, Nicole had been expected. A family gathering was planned, nothing extravagant, just another ordinary dinner, another routine night. But she never showed. No phone call, no message. And for Nicole Brown Simpson, a mother of two and a woman known for her meticulous care, silence was unusual. Alarming, even. Her friend who had planned to meet her earlier tried calling several times. No response. He drove by her home and was met with something he couldn't ignore. Nicole's dog, a large Akita pacing anxiously near the gate, its paws streaked with something dark, blood. Its whimpers, at once urgent and restrained, unsettled him. He called the police. It was after midnight when officers arrived at the property. The neighborhood was still, the only sounds the rustle of trees and the soft whine of the dog. The front gate was unlocked. Lights inside were still on. There were no signs of forced entry, no smashed windows, no screaming neighbors. But the moment they turned the corner of the walkway leading around the property, everything changed. Nicole Brown Simpson lay slumped at the foot of the steps outside her condo's front entrance. Blood pooled beneath her body. Her head was bowed unnaturally, throat slashed with precision and cruelty. Near her, another body, Ronald Goldman, younger, athletic, dressed in casual black. His wounds were numerous and frenzied, suggesting a struggle. The pattern was violent but targeted. The killer had not been in a rush. There was control in the brutality. Police cordoned off the scene immediately. As the forensics team began their work, they found few immediate clues. A single black leather glove near the bodies, a knit cap, a partially smudged shoe print in blood. Nicole's keys and purse were still in the house. Nothing appeared stolen. The sliding glass doors were intact. Her children slept upstairs, untouched by the violence just outside their home. What was clear was that this wasn't random. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It had all the hallmarks of something personal, emotional, intentional. Within hours, detectives began piecing together the last known movements of the victims. Nicole had spent the evening at her daughter's dance recital. Ronald Goldman was believed to have dropped by only briefly, reportedly to return a pair of sunglasses Nicole's mother had left behind at the restaurant where he worked. Neither had any indication of what was to come. Nicole, by many accounts, had been trying to rebuild her life. She was known among friends for her warmth and energy, but also for a sense of caution that had grown over the past few years. There were whispers of fear, hints in conversations, a protective instinct that seemed to deepen after her divorce from a man whose fame often overshadowed his presence, Orenthal James Simpson. Simpson, known to millions as OJ, had once been one of America's most celebrated athletes, a Heisman Trophy winner, a record-breaking NFL running back, and later a charismatic commercial spokesman and actor. But behind the smile and the spotlight, there had been another narrative, one less visible. Police officers familiar with the couple's past recalled previous domestic disturbance calls, reports of yelling, of physical confrontations, of Nicole crying, pleading over the phone. Some even documented injuries. Restraining orders had been filed, but like many domestic cases involving high-profile figures, the warnings were often buried beneath headlines and court settlements. Still, nothing in the past could have prepared investigators for this. In the early stages of the investigation, there was no official suspect. Yet within hours, O.J. Simpson's name quietly began to circulate behind closed doors. Not because of public suspicion, but because those in law enforcement knew the history. They knew Nicole had feared him, and more importantly, they knew what she had said. In previous reports, Nicole had expressed deep concern that if anything ever happened to her, it wouldn't be an accident. For now, though, no accusations were made. Only questions, many without answers. Why was Ronald Goldman there at that exact time? Did he witness the attack, or was he caught in the middle of it? Why had no one heard the violence? What did the killer take, if anything? Forensic analysts examined the glove found near the bodies. Blood was present. Fibers, too. The shoe print didn't match any common brand. It appeared to be from a rare Italian model, typically worn by athletes or celebrities. No murder weapon was recovered, but the nature of the wounds suggested a single-edged blade, long and sharp, possibly a combat or utility knife. Inside the house, More subtle details emerged. Nicole's calendar had a note for the night of the murder, nothing remarkable. Her answering machine contained no alarming messages, but on her bedroom nightstand among books and photographs there was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten letter, undated, torn at the top. It read simply, "I tried. I really did." It wasn't signed. As dawn approached and news crews began to gather beyond the yellow tape, detectives knew what they were facing wasn't just a homicide. It was a powder keg, ready to explode the moment a name was officially tied to the case. For now, they moved in silence, taking in every fiber, every drop of blood, every irregularity in the carpet fibers. What had started as a call about a woman not answering her phone had quickly evolved into one of the most brutal, mysterious double homicides in recent Los Angeles history. And somewhere, a killer was awake, silent, watching, possibly even confident. The kind of confidence only someone close to the victims might possess. Someone who knew the layout of the house. Someone who had a reason, and someone who perhaps believed they had gotten away with it. In the first few hours following the discovery, the scene on South Bundy Drive remained deceptively calm. Yellow tape cordoned off the sidewalk. Officers stood silently under the soft wash of floodlights, while forensic technicians crouched and cataloged every trace of evidence, blood droplets, shoe imprints, partial fingerprints on a nearby gate. But beneath the procedural efficiency, there was a mounting unease. Detectives on the scene weren't simply investigating a double homicide. They were stepping into the undercurrent of a life that had long been entangled in control, celebrity, fear, and unresolved tension. Nicole Brown Simpson was not a nameless victim. She had been a fixture, however unwilling, in the public eye. Once the wife of one of America's most revered sports icons, she had lived a life framed by visibility, often smiling in photographs, her children in her arms, appearing at galas and events with the man once dubbed the Juice. But behind the images carefully presented to the world, there had been turmoil, and now the facade had violently collapsed. Ronald Goldman, by contrast, was relatively unknown outside of his social circles. 25 years old, he worked as a waiter, occasionally modeled, and was known among friends as driven and easygoing. His presence at Nicole's home that night had not been planned far in advance. According to those close to him, he was simply returning a pair of sunglasses Nicole's mother had left at the restaurant. A brief stop, a routine errand. Nothing that would suggest the last moments of his life were approaching. Inside the West Los Angeles precinct, the initial reports painted a grim picture. The stab wounds were numerous, targeted, and executed with force. Nicole had sustained deep incisions to the neck, almost severing major arteries. There was evidence she had been attacked first, suggesting the killer's attention had been focused primarily on her. Ronald, however, had injuries consistent with defensive wounds, cuts across the hands and arms, implying that he had fought back, perhaps arriving mid-assault or attempting to intervene. As the evidence began to mount, so did the implications. This was not a robbery. There was no forced entry, no valuables missing, no ransacked interiors. The only items disturbed were those found in proximity to the victims. That kind of specificity, intimate, controlled, and violent, suggested something personal. Someone with a connection, someone who had a reason not to steal, but to destroy. Investigators combed through Nicole's background methodically. Friends, neighbors, co-workers, anyone who might offer a window into her recent behavior. One pattern quickly emerged. Nicole had been fearful in the weeks leading up to her death. She had told close friends about strange phone calls, about feeling watched. She had confided that she didn't feel safe, but often dismissed it outwardly, trying not to seem paranoid. Several friends recalled conversations that, in hindsight, felt almost like warnings. One friend recounted Nicole saying, "If something ever happens to me, it's not going to be an accident." At the time, it was brushed off, an emotional exaggeration in the wake of a contentious divorce. But now, those words resonated with a chilling clarity. The detectives also examined previous police reports. There were several. A decade earlier, officers had been dispatched to the Simpson residence multiple times for domestic disturbance calls. Nicole had filed reports of physical abuse. She had called 911 in terror. One particular call, preserved on tape, documented her begging for help while accusing her then-husband of trying to break down the door. These weren't vague allegations. They were documented, verified, and frightening. But for all those reports, the consequences had been minimal. A single conviction for misdemeanor spousal abuse, probation, counseling, fines. The cycle had continued. This was not unusual. Even in high-profile cases, domestic violence often faded behind public relations efforts and legal maneuvering. For many women like Nicole, the danger didn't end with divorce. In some cases, it escalated. What stood out to investigators wasn't just the presence of a violent history. It was the sharpness of Nicole's isolation. She had distanced herself. She had begun to rebuild. She had wanted peace. Yet peace hadn't come. Back at the crime scene, a new discovery further complicated the timeline. Inside Nicole's house, upstairs where her children had slept undisturbed, detectives found no signs of a struggle. The bedrooms were untouched, toys left on the floor, a book open beside a nightlight. Whatever had occurred outside had not extended into the home. This, too, was significant. The killer had stopped at the door. It was a deliberate boundary, one not driven by panic, but by intent. The children had been spared. That choice, conscious or not, told investigators something about the psyche of the killer. There had been control amidst the chaos. The dog, too, became part of the timeline. A large Akita had been found near the bodies, its white fur stained with blood. Multiple neighbors had reported hearing the dog barking frantically earlier in the night, long before any calls to 911 were made. One neighbor said she had looked out the window after hearing the animal's cries, but saw nothing. The barking had eventually stopped. That window of time between the disturbance and the discovery was now crucial. By the next morning, news of the double homicide had begun to spread. Local press arrived first, then national outlets. Cameramen set up outside the police barricades. Commentators speculated without facts. Rumors accelerated through media channels and radio broadcasts. And in that whirlwind, one name began to surface, quietly at first, whispered among reporters, then discussed more boldly: O.J. Simpson. Not because police had made an arrest, not because a warrant had been issued, but because in the eyes of the public, connection breeds suspicion. The country had long followed O.J.'s story, his football glory, his rise as an entertainer, his seemingly perfect family. Now that narrative was breaking down. Still, officially, O.J. Simpson was not a suspect. Not yet. He was, however, a person of interest, someone with a personal history, proximity, and motive, all of which required scrutiny. Detectives began preparations to request a formal interview. The goal was not to accuse, but to clarify. Where had he been that night? Had he spoken to Nicole recently? Did he have any knowledge of visitors to her home? As the investigators pieced together the puzzle, one unsettling truth remained. Nicole had lived under threat for years, and now she was gone. Her voice silenced, her warnings confirmed. The brutality of her death wasn't just a crime scene. It was a consequence of inaction, of missed signals, of systems designed to protect but slow to respond when the danger came dressed in charisma and fame. In the days to come, the narrative would deepen, evidence would emerge, allegiances would shift. But in this moment, before the cameras took over, before courtrooms were filled, before the world watched, there was a singular, sobering certainty. Someone had planned this, someone had watched, and someone, somewhere, was confident that the story would never reach them. In the hours that followed the initial response, Los Angeles law enforcement faced not just a homicide, but the burden of scale of emotion, scale of attention, and scale of consequence. This was no ordinary double murder. Every new detail carried the potential to unravel reputations, shift public perception, or disrupt lives far beyond the crime scene. Every decision, every leak, every step in the chain of evidence would matter. By mid-morning, the forensic teams completed their initial sweep of the scene on South Bundy. The blood trails, splatter patterns, positions of the bodies, all told a story of urgency, of intensity, of a killer who had acted decisively but not chaotically. This wasn't the work of someone who panicked. It was swift, intentional, and efficient. Nicole's body had been left near the bottom of the steps leading to her front door, partially covered in shadow, but still visibly exposed. Her injuries, multiple deep incisions, particularly around the neck, suggested she had been the primary target. Ronald Goldman, found a short distance away, had sustained wounds on his hands, arms, torso, and face, consistent with defensive action. The conclusion was clear. Ronald had not come to harm. He had walked into it. His visit was unplanned, unexpected. According to a co-worker at the restaurant Mezzaluna, Nicole's mother had called earlier in the evening about a pair of sunglasses she had left behind. Ronald volunteered to drop them off after his shift ended. It was meant to be a small gesture, a courteous act. a simple detour on the way home. But the sunglasses were never delivered. Instead, Ronald found something waiting outside that house, something that would end his life within moments of arrival. The positioning of his body, the angle of the wounds, and the state of the front gate suggested he never even made it inside. No doorbell rang, no goodbye was ever spoken. He may have barely had time to comprehend the threat before it consumed him. What troubled investigators, beyond the horror of the scene, was the silence, the sheer quiet of it all. No neighbor had called about screams. No lights had turned on in nearby homes during the window of time when the attack likely occurred. Even the dogs barking, reported by multiple residents, had been heard but not acted upon. One elderly neighbor who lived 2 houses down described hearing what sounded like a scuffle, muffled, indistinct like someone wrestling in the bushes, but she didn't call the police. She thought it might have been raccoons. That was the nature of violence sometimes. It didn't always arrive with spectacle. It crept in with the breeze, left without ceremony, and only afterward did people realize what they'd heard was the last sound a person would ever make. At headquarters, investigators began constructing the timeline. Nicole had attended her daughter's dance recital earlier that evening, accompanied by friends and family. Multiple witnesses confirmed she was in good spirits, laughing, attentive, composed. There had been no indication of any pending argument, no mention of fear or stress. Afterward, she returned home with her children and made several routine calls. By all accounts, it had been a typical evening in a life that had recently begun to feel normal again. The timeline placed the probable time of death between late evening and just past midnight. Based on the cooling of the bodies and the state of the blood, forensic analysts estimated that the murders had taken place no more than an hour or two before they were discovered. But the absence of any forensic evidence inside the home complicated matters. The killer had not entered the house. They had waited or perhaps followed, and struck only once Nicole was outside. That detail raised a crucial question. Was the killer watching the house? If so, how long had they been watching? Was this a spontaneous act driven by rage, or a calculated moment planned for the perfect window of opportunity? As police reviewed the physical evidence, one item stood out: an Aris isotoner leather glove, soaked in blood, found just beyond the fence, separating the walkway from the front lawn. It was not placed deliberately. It appeared to have been dropped, possibly by accident or in haste, but its presence was significant. It did not belong to either of the victims. Forensic specialists began testing the glove for DNA. Blood samples were taken, photographed, and cataloged. At this stage, the glove offered the strongest potential to tie the killer to the scene. Its style was expensive, the type worn not for warmth but as a fashion accessory, commonly seen among athletes, actors, and public figures who favored tailored, high-end apparel. Detectives knew this detail would matter later. Another discovery added a subtle but meaningful layer to the case: footprints. Partial impressions in blood led away from the bodies, turning back toward the gate. The prints were consistent with a size 12 shoe, and the tread pattern, though incomplete, matched a rare model of Italian designer footwear, Bruno Magli. These were not common shoes. They weren't sold in most department stores and weren't the kind of items someone stumbled across randomly. The implication was clear. Whoever left those prints had a specific taste and enough means to afford it. The crime lab also confirmed that multiple drops of blood had been found near the glove and the rear gate, separate from the pools surrounding the bodies. These drops were not from the victims. They were smaller, indicating they may have come from an injury the killer sustained during the attack. If true, that could provide DNA, an invaluable resource for identification. As the lab began processing samples, detectives turned their attention to personal accounts. Friends of Nicole were brought in for questioning. One of her closest confidants described the final weeks of her life as cautiously optimistic. Nicole had recently remodeled her condo, had begun socializing again, and had even started a new fitness routine. But beneath that progress, there were moments of tension. She had mentioned feeling watched, even when no one was around. She once found a photo she hadn't placed on her dashboard. Another time, she received a silent call. No words, just breathing. She changed her number afterward. These moments weren't enough for her to seek legal action again. But they painted a portrait of quiet, lingering anxiety. It was as though she had escaped something only physically, not emotionally. And now, her fears had materialized in the most brutal fashion imaginable. Investigators also began to consider psychological profiles. The nature of the attack, intimate, rage-fueled, with signs of overkill, pointed to a personal motive. There were no signs of robbery or assault of a different nature. The killer hadn't taken anything but lives, and that pointed overwhelmingly to someone who knew Nicole, perhaps even someone who had once claimed to love her. Yet law enforcement still refrained from publicly naming any suspects. The evidence was compelling, but not yet conclusive. The case was building rapidly, but it required patience. One misstep, one premature arrest, one piece of evidence mishandled, and the entire case could unravel in the spotlight. The final layer of the day's investigation came from an unexpected angle: a handwritten list found in Nicole's home. Tucked inside a kitchen drawer, it included various errands, groceries, and names. Near the bottom, a brief note had been scribbled in smaller writing. "Get glasses from restaurant. Ron said he'll bring them by." It was simple, unassuming. But for detectives, it clarified the moment of Ronald's arrival. He had been expected. His presence at the house was not coincidental, which meant the killer may have seen both Nicole and Ronald as intended targets, or that Ronald had simply been in the wrong place at the worst possible time. In either case, the pattern of violence suggested that the killer had not hesitated. Once begun, the attack had been relentless. The brutality, the risk, the intimacy, it pointed to someone who believed they would not be stopped, someone with confidence, someone with history, someone perhaps with practice. The morning after the murders, a heaviness settled over Los Angeles, a sense that the city had crossed a threshold it couldn't retreat from. What had begun as a horrific crime was now evolving into something else, a national conversation in the making. But for the detectives assigned to the case, the task at hand remained immediate and clinical: reconstruct the final hours of two lives, follow the blood, chase the motive, and let the evidence guide them toward the truth. Inside the precinct, detectives began to conduct formal interviews. Friends, co-workers, family members, and neighbors were questioned to map every minute of the victim's timeline and the ripple effects surrounding it. As statements were collected and cross-referenced, one thing became apparent. A pattern of inconsistencies was beginning to form, not within the timeline of the victims, but in the accounts given by those adjacent to their lives. One of those individuals, of course, was Orenthal James Simpson. OJ had been notified of Nicole's death early that morning. According to initial reports, he was emotional but composed, asking few questions and offering a vague account of his whereabouts the night before. He told police that he had been preparing for an early morning flight and had spent the evening at home, organizing his luggage and speaking with a friend. On the surface, the story was ordinary, but when investigators began to test it against witness statements, surveillance footage, and flight records, questions began to emerge. First, the housekeeper at Simpson's estate reported hearing movement and raised voices around the time police believed the murders had occurred. She claimed she had not seen OJ between late evening and the following morning, when he abruptly left for the airport. This alone did not incriminate, but it cast doubt on his narrative. Then came the driver, Alan Park, a limousine chauffeur scheduled to pick OJ up and drive him to the airport. Park's statement became a critical piece in the emerging picture. He recalled arriving at the estate, ringing the gate intercom multiple times between 10:25 and 10:40 p.m., with no response. The house appeared dark. There was no sign of movement. Then, at approximately 10:55 p.m., Park saw a figure, tall, dressed in dark clothing, walking toward the front entrance from the side of the house. Minutes later, the lights came on. OJ emerged, apologizing for the delay and instructing Park to load his bags. What disturbed investigators about this wasn't just the timing, but the gap, the absence. Nearly 30 minutes of no visual or audible response, followed by sudden, suspicious activity. If Simpson had been home all along, why hadn't he answered the intercom? Why was he only seen once a shadowy figure emerged from the side of the house? Was he out? Had he returned? And if so, from where? Investigators requested access to OJ's vehicle, a white Ford Bronco parked outside his estate. Upon initial inspection, nothing immediately jumped out, but under forensic light, stains were identified, small but notable. Samples were collected for DNA testing. Meanwhile, a second glove was found, matching the one discovered at the crime scene. It was lying behind the guest house near the rear of Simpson's property, partially covered in foliage. The discovery was pivotal. A pair of gloves, identical in brand, size, and composition, found at two separate locations, one at the scene of the murders, the other on Simpson's property. It was the first solid connection linking the deaths of Nicole and Ronald to another location. And that location belonged to the only person who had both proximity and motive. Still, police remained methodical. This was not a moment for haste. In cases involving high-profile individuals, mistakes carried amplified consequences. The team resisted media pressure and speculation, choosing instead to double down on forensics, timelines, and cross-examinations. The approach was deliberate. Gather everything, make no assumptions, let the evidence tell its own story. Back at the lab, the blood samples taken from the crime scene, the glove, the Bronco, and Simpson's estate were now under analysis. DNA matching was a relatively new tool in 1994, but it had already proven its power in previous cases. In this one, it could serve as the difference between conjecture and confirmation. Analysts worked around the clock. Meanwhile, officers conducted follow-up interviews with Nicole's friends. One of them, a close confidant, recalled an incident that occurred just weeks before her death. Nicole had discovered footprints outside her bedroom window, muddy, deliberate. She had told her friend she was certain someone had been watching her, but when she contacted authorities, there was little they could do without direct evidence of trespassing. No formal report was filed. Another friend described Nicole's behavior as on edge in the last month of her life. She had stopped jogging alone. She had hired a private security consultant to evaluate her home, but dismissed the idea of installing security cameras, fearing the optics might seem paranoid or draw more media attention. In many ways, she was still negotiating her place in the public eye, desiring safety, but not scandal. These accounts didn't just add context to Nicole's final days. They added a layer of tragic inevitability. She had feared this. She had lived with the knowledge that peace was a fragile thing, easily disrupted by those unwilling to let go. Her death was not a solitary act of violence. It was the culmination of unaddressed fear, of a legal system that often failed to protect until it was too late. The deeper the investigators dug, the more the contradictions mounted. There were gaps in alibis, objects out of place, and statements that didn't align. None of it was definitive on its own. But when laid side by side, the shape of something darker began to form. A picture of a night meticulously cleansed, yet impossible to erase completely. By the end of the day, law enforcement had not yet named a suspect. But within the inner circle of the department, a shift had occurred. The case was no longer an open-ended mystery. It was becoming a funnel, drawing closer and closer to a singular point of focus. Still, they waited. Still, they verified. Still, they built the case piece by piece. The weight of what they were uncovering was beginning to settle in. This was not just about the murders of two people. It was about what those murders represented: a collapse of trust, a failure of protection, and a reckoning with the costs of ignoring warning signs. Nicole Brown Simpson had lived a life where fear was often met with disbelief. Now the silence she had endured was being broken, but only after it was too late to save her. As the sun set once again over Brentwood, the crime scene remained empty, but its gravity deepened. Somewhere, someone knew exactly what had happened that night, knew every detail, knew where the weapon had gone, what the gloves had touched, how long the blood had stained the concrete, and that someone was no longer invisible to those watching. In the quiet hours before the storm, something shifted. Inside the Los Angeles Police Department, the tension had begun to harden into certainty. The case was evolving from layers of suspicion to a slow, methodical convergence of evidence. Glove to glove, blood to DNA, shoe print to rare designer sole, each piece more precise than the last. And yet for the public, the story was still shrouded in uncertainty. There were whispers, headlines circling like vultures, television anchors holding their breath. But no one had said the name aloud, not with weight, not with accusation, until now. As the forensic reports rolled in, the DNA extracted from blood drops found on the glove, the vehicle, and the pathway near the crime scene matched not only the victims, but also pointed to a third profile. And when compared to a sample provided by the person of interest, collected voluntarily during early questioning, it aligned with chilling precision. The evidence, once circumstantial, was crystallizing into something far more damning. Behind the scenes, detectives were preparing to file charges. A formal arrest warrant was drafted. A press conference was scheduled, and arrangements were made for the individual in question to surrender peacefully to law enforcement that morning. But when officers arrived at the Brentwood estate to take him into custody, the gates were locked, the house was quiet, and he was gone. For the first time since the murders, the narrative broke containment. The person who had agreed to turn himself in, who had promised cooperation, had instead vanished. The Los Angeles Police Department issued a public alert. The media, already hovering, erupted. What had previously been a simmering mystery burst into full flame. Televisions across the country flickered to life with breaking news updates. The man wanted for questioning in connection to the double homicide of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman was now considered a fugitive. And the man was O.J. Simpson. Almost instantly, the case transformed. It was no longer about methodical investigation. It was now a manhunt, a spectacle, a cultural earthquake. What had been a local crime was now a national obsession. The sight of Simpson's white Ford Bronco weaving slowly down the Los Angeles freeways would become etched into American consciousness. Inside the vehicle sat Simpson, in the back seat, holding a firearm to his head. Driving was Al Cowlings, a longtime friend and former teammate, speaking with dispatchers in a desperate attempt to de-escalate the crisis. Police trailed cautiously behind. News helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting the surreal procession live to a captive nation. Millions of viewers watched as the low-speed chase unfolded in real time. Freeway exits were closed. Crowds gathered on overpasses, waving signs of support or disbelief. Children on their parents' shoulders cheered or cried without knowing why. The chase was not fast. It was not violent. It was not like anything Americans had ever seen. It was slow, strange, and heavy with implications no one could fully comprehend. At one point, Simpson's voice could be heard through a phone call relayed to the LAPD. He sounded tired, broken, speaking not of murder, but of his children, pleading not for escape, but for time. He didn't confess. He didn't deny. He hovered somewhere between collapse and surrender, a man unraveling under the weight of something vast and irreversible. The emotional gravity of that day was difficult to quantify. On one hand, it humanized a man now at the center of a national firestorm. On the other, it fractured public perception into sharp, irreconcilable pieces. For some, he was a desperate man caught in a tidal wave of accusation. For others, the slow-speed pursuit was an admission in motion, a man fleeing not just from justice, but from accountability. As the Bronco approached the Brentwood neighborhood, a crowd had already formed near the Simpson residence. Police negotiated the surrender carefully. Hours passed. Eventually, the vehicle pulled into the driveway, and O.J. was taken into custody without violence. He had with him a passport, a disguise, a large sum of cash, and a loaded firearm. The contents of that car told their own story. A man prepared to disappear, or perhaps torn between doing so and turning back. It was never made clear which direction he truly intended to follow. What followed was a tidal wave of commentary. Television hosts, legal analysts, former athletes, civil rights leaders, all weighed in. Some cried injustice, others called it betrayal. The country split in two, not neatly along political lines, but along something deeper, more visceral. Lines of race, class, fame, power, and the elusive nature of justice in America. But within the LAPD, the path remained clear. With Simpson in custody, the focus returned to the evidence. Investigators rechecked timelines, flights, phone records, fuel receipts. They mapped every inch of his movement between the hours of 9:30 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. on the night of the murders. Each inconsistency widened. Each attempt at clarity revealed more questions. No credible alibi had emerged. No explanation accounted for the blood, the glove, the footprints, or the timeline gaps. Yet what law enforcement understood, perhaps better than anyone else at that point, was that this would not be an ordinary trial. It would not rest on evidence alone. It would not be decided in quiet courtrooms free of cameras. This would be a cultural reckoning. Every statement, every cross-examination, every ruling would be scrutinized under the unforgiving light of national exposure. And through it all, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, two lives extinguished violently, would be remembered not only as victims, but as symbols of a system struggling to balance the scales when fame distorted the weight of truth. The media's obsession with the slow-speed pursuit eclipsed the solemnity of their deaths, and that too carried its own tragedy. Because behind the flashing lights, behind the aerial shots of freeway exits and crowds waving signs, two families were grieving. They were grieving not only for the loss of life, but for the way that loss had been absorbed into spectacle, for the way their children's names were now headlines, For the way justice, however defined, seemed to be slipping through the cracks of performance. The pursuit had ended. The man was in custody. But the trial, the media war, the national soul-searching, it was all just beginning. In the wake of the Bronco chase, the public imagination had reached a fever pitch. But within the stark, windowless walls of the Los Angeles Criminal Courts building, another storm was beginning to gather, one quieter, more technical, yet no less consequential. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, legal analysts, and detectives converged behind the scenes to prepare for what was rapidly becoming one of the most significant legal showdowns in modern American history. Before the world could see a single moment of testimony, the architecture of the trial had to be built, brick by brick, motion by motion. O.J. Simpson, now formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, entered the pretrial phase under maximum scrutiny. Every appearance he made, from arraignment to preliminary hearings, was dissected by television crews and headline writers. His legal team, which had already begun to expand, now morphed into something unprecedented, a tactical apparatus designed not only to defend, but to dominate. At the helm was Robert Shapiro, a seasoned negotiator known for his mastery of pretrial strategy and client control. Alongside him were soon-to-be household names: Johnny Cochran, a civil rights attorney with a charismatic courtroom presence; F. Lee Bailey, a former Marine and celebrated cross-examiner; Alan Dershowitz, Harvard law professor and appellate expert. This collective would later be dubbed the Dream Team, not by themselves, but by a media fascinated with the paradox, a murder trial wrapped in the theater of celebrity. Across the aisle, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office formed its own alliance. Leading the prosecution was Marcia Clark, a career prosecutor with a no-nonsense demeanor and a reputation for meticulous case preparation. She was joined by Bill Hodgman and later, Christopher Darden, each bringing their own resolve to what was shaping up to be a volatile, high-profile legal arena. From the outset, it was clear the trial would not operate under the normal gravitational pull of justice. The courtroom, even in its physical form, would be transformed into a national stage. The defense team anticipated this, and they moved quickly to shift the narrative before the trial even began. One of their first strategies was to challenge the integrity of the investigation itself. The defense filed early motions to suppress key pieces of evidence, arguing mishandling, contamination, and even deliberate planting. They pointed to the collection methods of the LAPD crime scene technicians, raising questions about chain of custody and suggesting that police, in their eagerness to implicate a suspect, had cut corners and compromised the case. Most notably, they targeted Detective Mark Fuhrman, one of the lead investigators on the scene. The defense uncovered audio recordings in which Fuhrman, years earlier, had made repeated racist remarks, including boasts about fabricating evidence. The implications were seismic. Though the recordings were not related directly to the Simpson case, they provided the defense with a critical foothold. If the credibility of one detective could be undermined, perhaps the entire case could be destabilized by association. The prosecution, meanwhile, continued to build its core argument, focused less on character, more on science. DNA evidence was central. The blood trails found at the crime scene in the Ford Bronco and on the glove behind Simpson's house had all yielded DNA results that matched both victims and Simpson himself. This evidence, prosecutors believed, formed the spine of a case rooted in probability beyond doubt. But the challenge lay not in proving the data, it was in communicating it. DNA science in 1994 was not widely understood by the general public. The burden fell on the prosecution to explain complex genetic markers and statistical likelihoods in ways that were compelling, accessible, and free from error. Any misstep, even minor, could be seized upon by the defense and repackaged as reasonable doubt. Media influence had by now saturated every angle of the case. Court TV was preparing for live coverage. Print journalists jockeyed for access. Analysts across networks argued passionately about race, class, gender, policing, and the American legal system. The trial had not yet begun, but its cultural trial was already underway. This posed its own dangers. Jury selection, one of the most critical and delicate phases of any trial, would now be conducted under the unblinking eye of the nation. A pool of potential jurors, already saturated in coverage, would have to be vetted not just for bias, but for the deeper psychological impact of media exposure, preconceptions, and their own internalized beliefs about the figures involved. Behind all of this sat the memory of the victims, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. With each passing news cycle, their humanity risked being obscured by spectacle. Prosecutors made deliberate choices to center their loss in court filings and early motions, painting portraits not of statistics or crime scene diagrams, but of lives stolen. Nicole, a mother navigating life after divorce. Ronald, a young man whose only crime was delivering a forgotten pair of sunglasses. In a justice system increasingly pressured by performance, the prosecution fought to preserve the simplest, most essential truth. Two people were murdered, and their deaths demanded an answer. Yet the defense refused to cede moral ground. They framed Simpson as a victim of media bias, racial profiling, and an institution eager to destroy a black icon to atone for prior failures. They cited the LAPD's history of brutality and corruption, linking it not only to Simpson's case, but to the broader social context. In doing so, they did more than build a defense. They built a movement. These arguments were not unfounded. Just a few years earlier, the city had erupted after the acquittal of officers in the Rodney King beating. Racial tension was not abstract in Los Angeles. It was woven into the daily reality of law enforcement and communities of color. The defense team knew this, and they weaponized it expertly. The result was a pretrial phase unlike any other. Every motion, every press conference, every legal maneuver carried echoes of something larger. The trial would not merely adjudicate guilt or innocence. It would become a mirror, reflecting how America saw itself and how willing it was to believe that justice could be blind in a courtroom where fame and race collided. As the opening statements approached, both sides knew what was at stake. For the prosecution, it was about the facts, the blood, the glove, the timeline, the motive. For the defense, it was about the lens, the frame through which those facts would be viewed. Truth in the courtroom would no longer be a matter of what happened, but of who could make it more believable. And somewhere between the science and the story, between evidence and emotion, 12 jurors would eventually be asked to decide. Not just what happened on a warm Los Angeles night, but what kind of justice America was capable of delivering. When the courtroom doors finally opened to the public, what lay beyond them was not merely a space of justice, it was a stage. Months of speculation, leaked documents, public outrage, and televised manhunts had culminated in this moment. The trial of Orenthal James Simpson was officially underway, and with it came the burden of expectations far exceeding any single crime. This was not just about a double homicide. This was about race, wealth, fame, domestic violence, institutional failure, and the deep fracture lines embedded in American society. For the jurors, 12 men and women drawn from one of the most diverse cities in the world, it was an unthinkable responsibility. They had been selected not just for their impartiality, but for their ability to carry the psychological weight of a nation. Each one had been questioned, scrutinized, dissected by both legal teams for any trace of bias, media exposure, or ideology that could compromise their judgment. But no selection process could prepare anyone for what was to come. The courtroom itself felt transformed. Multiple camera feeds were installed to stream the proceedings live, allowing millions of Americans, households, classrooms, office break rooms, to follow each word, glance, and gesture in real time. It was the first fully televised criminal trial of its kind, and it would redefine how justice was consumed in the modern era. The opening statements began with the prosecution. Marcia Clark stepped forward, calm but firm. Her words were deliberate, not showy. She framed the case as a matter of evidence, not conjecture. She walked the jury through the events of the night, pointing to forensic findings, the blood, the glove, the DNA. Her tone was not dramatic, it was procedural. This, she insisted, was not about race or celebrity. It was about two innocent people whose lives had been brutally taken, and the physical trail left behind by the man who did it. Then came Johnny Cochran for the defense. In contrast, Cochran's voice carried a practiced rhythm, measured yet emotional. He did not immediately challenge the crime scene or deny that the deaths were tragic. Instead, he shifted the focus. This, he claimed, was a frame job, a rush to judgment by a racially biased police force. He spoke of Detective Mark Fuhrman and his history of documented racism. He painted the LAPD not as protectors, but as predators, hungry for a conviction at any cost. And his most powerful weapon wasn't a piece of physical evidence. It was doubt. If the police could lie, he argued, the evidence they presented could no longer be trusted. The courtroom settled into its rhythm. but tension loomed. It wasn't long before one of the most significant and controversial pieces of evidence made its appearance: the glove. Prosecutors had built a portion of their case around two leather gloves. One, soaked in blood, had been found at the murder scene. The other, matching in brand and size, was discovered behind Simpson's guest house. Forensic testing had confirmed that both gloves contained traces of blood from Nicole Brown Simpson, Ronald Goldman, and O.J. Simpson. On paper, the evidence was staggering. It placed the accused not only at the scene but tied him biologically to the violence. But then came a decision that would haunt the prosecution's strategy forever. They asked Simpson to try on the gloves. The moment was electric. The courtroom held its breath. The nation leaned forward through screens. Simpson, standing in front of the jury, slid his hand into the first glove. It resisted. He turned his hand, flexed his fingers. Still, it didn't fit. He tried the second. Same result. The leather appeared tight, difficult to pull over the latex gloves he wore underneath to protect the evidence. His attorneys watched in silence, already knowing what Cochran would say to the jury: "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." Those words would become a cultural reference point, repeated across talk shows, dinner tables, and headlines. They crystallized the defense's entire strategy into a single punchy phrase, one that bypassed legal nuance and planted a seed of doubt the prosecution couldn't easily dislodge. Privately, the prosecution argued that the gloves had shrunk due to blood saturation and refrigeration, that Simpson's latex gloves and deliberately stiff hand movements contributed to the misfit. But scientifically, those explanations, however plausible, did not resonate with a jury that had just witnessed what seemed like a visual contradiction to the narrative they were being sold. And so, the tide began to shift. It wasn't the only point of contention. The scientific evidence, particularly the DNA findings, became a battlefield of understanding versus confusion. At the time, DNA profiling was still relatively new to the courtroom. It carried weight among experts but felt abstract to ordinary citizens. The prosecution brought in forensic specialists to explain how a series of genetic markers, when matched, could identify a person with statistical certainty. They used charts, diagrams, and analogies to convey the complexity of the analysis. But the more they explained, the more jurors seemed overwhelmed. Terms like allele, restriction fragment, match probability flew through the air like foreign currency. The defense seized the opportunity. They didn't need to disprove the science, they just needed to make it feel too complicated, too uncertain, too vulnerable to contamination or error. They emphasized that the LAPD had never handled such a volume of DNA evidence before, that lab technicians had cross-handled samples, that chain of custody logs were incomplete. It didn't matter whether the mishandling was intentional or not. What mattered was the introduction of reasonable doubt. One by one, prosecution witnesses were challenged, their credibility questioned, their expertise tested in public. And as the jury watched the defense dismantle the foundation of the state's evidence, the lines between truth and interpretation began to blur. This was the paradox of forensic strength. It was only as persuasive as the jury's ability to understand and believe it. And in a trial where emotion, personality, and racial context had already saturated every corner of discourse, scientific clarity struggled to survive. Still, the prosecution pressed forward, methodically presenting the timeline, the hair and fiber analysis, the cuts on Simpson's hands the morning after the murder, the blood on the Bronco door handle. On paper, it was a case supported by physical reality. But in the courtroom, perception was rapidly becoming its own form of reality. The trial had become something bigger than guilt or innocence. It was a referendum on truth itself, on who was allowed to define it, who got to challenge it, and how much of it could be filtered through performance before it lost all meaning. The courtroom was no longer just a room for deliberation. It had become a microcosm of the fractured nation, one where every word, every piece of evidence, and every decision had become a symbol of something greater. The trial of O.J. Simpson was no longer just about two murders. It had evolved into a larger cultural moment, a spectacle where race, fame, and the justice system collided in ways no one had anticipated. By the time the defense's strategy to discredit the prosecution was in full swing, it was clear that the trial was slipping into murky waters. One of the most significant character attacks came from the defense team's decision to focus on Detective Mark Fuhrman, a central figure in the investigation. Fuhrman had already been established as one of the lead detectives at the scene of the crime, and his credibility was key to the prosecution's case. But when the defense unearthed tapes of Fuhrman making racially charged comments, and using racial slurs, it became the linchpin of the entire trial. Fuhrman, already a polarizing figure within the police force, now found himself the focal point of a much larger narrative. He was depicted not just as a rogue officer, but as a symbol of institutionalized racism within the LAPD. This was a calculated move by the defense to cast doubt on the integrity of the entire investigation. The argument was simple. If Fuhrman was racist, then everything he had touched, the evidence, the statements, the chain of custody, could be tainted. And if the jury could not trust Fuhrman, then they could not trust the case he had helped build. It wasn't just Fuhrman who was under attack. Throughout the trial, every witness for the prosecution was subjected to intense cross-examination. The defense dissected their credibility, twisted their words, and painted them as either incompetent or compromised. This relentless assault on the character of witnesses turned the trial into a battle not just of facts, but of reputations. In the court of public opinion, the lines between truth and manipulation blurred. What mattered was not whether the evidence was solid, but whether the jury could trust the people presenting it. As the days stretched into weeks, the strain on the jury began to show. The jurors were becoming weary, caught between the media's bombardment and the conflicting narratives being woven before them. They were trapped in a circus of misinformation, unable to escape the glare of public opinion. The courtroom had become a stage, but the jury was forced to live in the audience. And while the attorneys performed, the jury's doubt deepened. How could they possibly make a decision in the face of so much ambiguity? In the absence of clear answers, it was the shadows of doubt that began to cloud their judgment. Then, after months of tension, the day arrived. The jury had reached a verdict. When the clerk called the jury to deliver their decision, the world held its breath. The silence was oppressive as the foreman stood, holding the fate of one of the most high-profile figures in modern American history. The moment stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman sat in grim anticipation, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and fear. In that instant, the weight of the entire trial, the evidence, the arguments, the performances, crashed down onto the shoulders of 12 ordinary individuals, not guilty. The words reverberated through the room, through the airwaves, and into the living rooms of millions. In an instant, the nation was divided. Those who had followed the case closely were left stunned, while others cheered in relief. It was a verdict that seemed to defy the evidence. It seemed to many like a repudiation of everything the victims had suffered. The cultural impact of the verdict was immediate and profound. For many, the decision was seen as an affirmation of the flaws within the American justice system, a system that was more about the performance of justice than its substance. The trial had exposed the biases that ran through both the media and the courtroom. Race, class, and celebrity had all played their roles in shaping the narrative, and now it seemed that justice itself had been swept into the tide of spectacle. For the victims' families, the pain of the verdict was immense. Nicole and Ronald's families had already suffered the ultimate loss, but now they had to face the additional burden of knowing that, in the eyes of the law, the man who had taken their loved ones from them would walk free. Their grief, already unbearable, was now compounded by an overwhelming sense of injustice. But the aftermath of the criminal trial was not the end of the story. In 1997, the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman took the case to a civil court. This time, the burden of proof was lower. Instead of needing to prove Simpson's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, they only needed to demonstrate that it was more likely than not that Simpson was responsible for the deaths of Nicole and Ronald. In this trial, the victims' families found a measure of justice. The jury found O.J. Simpson liable for the deaths and awarded the Goldman family $33.5 million in damages, a financial restitution, but nothing could bring back the lives that were lost. In the years that followed, O.J. Simpson's life continued to spiral. Though he was awarded a settlement of sorts in the civil case, the public perception of him never fully recovered. His reputation as an athlete, once untarnished, was forever intertwined with the violent deaths of Nicole and Ronald. He faced numerous challenges, including bankruptcy, financial ruin, and a tarnished legacy that would follow him to the end of his days. For many, the Simpson case was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how justice in the eyes of the public can be elusive. The case became a touchstone in discussions about race relations, the power of fame, and the gaps within the legal system that allow for both exploitation and injustice. Ultimately, the trial of O.J. Simpson did not just leave a scar on the legal system. It left a wound on the fabric of American society. The echoes of that trial still reverberate in the way the public views celebrity, race, and the notion of justice itself. For some, O.J. was never truly punished for his actions. For others, the lack of conviction was a symbol of how the powerful could avoid accountability through wealth, influence, and manipulation of the legal system. And for the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, the trial was a painful reminder that the fight for justice is not always about winning in the courtroom. It is about the long, hard road of living with loss, of navigating the murky waters of public opinion, and of reconciling with a system that sometimes seems to fail when it is needed most. The legacy of the O.J. Simpson case is not just the tragic deaths of two people. It is a lasting examination of what justice truly means in a world where race, celebrity, and power intersect. And as the years have passed, that lesson has only become clearer. Justice is not always blind, and the pursuit of it can be more complex and more fraught with contradiction than we ever imagined. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.